What if I told you that the crowded restaurants, the overbooked flights, and the surging stock prices of companies like Disney and Uber are actually the loudest warning sirens of a coming systemic shift? We are currently living through a bizarre economic paradox, where the engine of the world is screaming in two different directions at once. One half of the world is dancing in the streets, spending record amounts on experiences and memories, while the other half, the digital backbone of our civilization, is quietly sharpening the guillotine for nearly 500,000 jobs. The question isn't whether the crash is coming, but whether you are looking at the right indicators to survive it. Hello, this is WarmInsight. Today, we're going to talk about the strange resilience of the global economy and the hidden structural realignment that is about to change everything. You know about job security and investment. Leaving a like and subscribing is a huge help to us. We have to start with the most confusing part of our current reality: the paradoxical resilience of the consumer. Even as inflation bites and interest rates remain a constant weight on the neck of the average household, people are refusing to stop spending. But they aren't buying things. They are buying moments. This is the experience economy, and it is acting as a massive temporary buffer against a recession. To understand why this is happening and why it is so dangerous, we have to look back at the Roaring '20s. Following the devastation of World War I and the 1918 flu pandemic, the global population was gripped by a desperate, almost manic need to live life to the fullest. This period wasn't just about jazz and flappers. It was a psychological reaction to years of suppressed consumption and existential fear. People in the 1920s spent money they didn't have on cars, radios, and cinema, creating an illusion of permanent prosperity. The economy looked invincible because the storefronts were full and the parties were loud. However, that consumer resilience was a thin veneer, covering a rotting structural foundation of debt and overproduction. Much like today, the 1920s saw a massive shift in how people valued their time and money. They weren't saving for a rainy day because they had just lived through a monsoon. When we see people today flocking to theme parks and calling Ubers for nights out despite rising prices, we are seeing a modern echo of 1927. It is a beautiful, vibrant period of growth that historically precedes a massive, sudden correction. When the bill finally comes due and the credit runs dry, from a psychological perspective, this behavior is rooted in what neuroscientists call hedonic adaptation and the scarcity mindset. When humans feel that their future is uncertain or that their freedom has been recently restricted, they undergo a shift in time preference. We move from long-term thinking to short-term gratification. This is often called revenge spending. Our brains are hardwired to prioritize immediate dopamine hits when the environment feels unstable. By spending on a vacation or a high-end dinner, we are effectively telling our nervous systems that we are safe and successful. Even if our bank accounts suggest otherwise, it is a collective cognitive bias, where we mistake the ability to spend for the existence of wealth. We are essentially self-medicating through discretionary spending, using the experience of luxury to mask the anxiety of a shifting economic landscape. This creates a feedback loop, where the more nervous we feel about the macroeconomy, the more we spend on small luxuries to feel a sense of control, which in turn keeps the economy looking healthy to outside observers. Think of it like a birthday party, happening on a luxury cruise ship that has just hit a small iceberg. To the people in the ballroom, everything is perfect. The music is playing, the champagne is flowing, and everyone is dressed in their finest clothes. Because the party is so loud and energetic, nobody notices the slight tilt of the floor, or the fact that the engine room is starting to take on water. The consumer is the party-goer. As long as the music plays, they will keep dancing. They feel the vibration of the hit, but they interpret it as just part of the ride. But in the basement of this ship, which represents the technology sector and the foundational infrastructure of our economy, the engineers are already putting on life jackets and trying to figure out which sections of the ship can be sacrificed to keep the rest afloat. This brings us to the second major engine of our multi-speed economy, the massive structural realignment of the technology sector. While you were booking your last flight, the tech industry was quietly forecasting over 447,000 layoffs by the end of 2026. This isn't just a temporary dip. It is a fundamental retooling of the digital age. If we look at the history of the Industrial Revolution, specifically the late 19th century, we see a perfect parallel. When the initial boom of steam power and early manufacturing began to plateau, companies realized that they had overhired and overextended themselves. They had built massive factories, with thousands of workers doing tasks that could eventually be streamlined. What followed was a brutal decade of efficiency, where the workforce was gutted in favor of more advanced machinery and tighter management structures. This wasn't because the economy was failing, but because the industry was maturing. The tech sector today is in its late 19th century phase. The hypergrowth era of the 2010s was the Wild West, where companies hired 10 people to do the job of one, just to keep them away from competitors. Now, with the advent of artificial intelligence and a shift in investor demand from growth to profitability, the machinery of the digital age is being upgraded. The layoffs we see today are the modern version of the automated loom. Replacing the hand weaver, it is a cold, calculated move toward a leaner, more efficient version of capitalism that doesn't require the same massive human overhead. The psychology behind these mass layoffs is often driven by institutional social proof and the fear of being the last one to pivot. In the corporate world, CEOs often suffer from a herd bias. When a leader like the head of Coinbase or Meta makes a preemptive strike by cutting staff or changing reporting structures, it sends a signal to every other board of directors that they are being lazy. If they don't do the same, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Management feels a psychological pressure to demonstrate discipline to shareholders. Even if a company is profitable, they might lay off 5% of their staff, simply because that is what the winners are doing right now. This creates a climate of fear that actually dampens innovation, as employees move from a mindset of creation to a mindset of survival. It is a collective movement, where the fear of appearing inefficient becomes more powerful than the desire to grow. To visualize this, imagine a world-class marathon runner who has spent the last 5 years eating every single calorie in sight to gain weight for a wrestling match that never happened. Now suddenly they are told they have to run a race in an hour. They are carrying 50 pounds of unnecessary fat. The tech sector is that runner. During the easy money era, these companies became bloated and heavy. They hired for projects that didn't exist and spent money on office, perks that had nothing to do with their core product. Now the economic climate has changed, and they have to run. The layoffs are the runner, desperately trying to sweat off 50 pounds in a single hour. It's painful, it's messy, and it looks like a crisis from the outside. But from the runner's perspective, it's the only way to win the race. They are shedding parts of themselves, not because they are dying, but because they are trying to become fast again. However, there is a darker side to this realignment that many people are missing, and that is the shift in transparency. The SEC is currently considering a move to allow semi-annual earnings reports instead of quarterly ones. This might sound like a boring bureaucratic change, but it is a massive earthquake for the average investor. Historically, this takes us back to the era before the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, before the Great Depression exposed the rot in the financial system. The stock market was essentially the Wild West. Companies could choose what they wanted to tell the public, and they could choose when they wanted to tell it. This led to a massive information asymmetry, where the insiders knew exactly when a company was failing, but the public didn't find out until the doors were literally locked. The introduction of quarterly reporting was a hard one. Victory for the common man. It forced companies to be honest at least 4 times a year. If we move back toward semi-annual reporting, we are effectively rewinding the clock nearly 100 years. We are entering an era of blind spots. In a fast-moving world, 6 months is an eternity. A company can go from being a market leader to being bankrupt in half that time. By reducing the frequency of data, the system is essentially protecting the big players, while leaving the retail investor to wander in the dark. Psychologically, this creates a phenomenon known as information gap anxiety. When people have less frequent access to reliable data, they don't become more patient, they become more speculative. Our brains hate a vacuum. If a company doesn't report its earnings for 6 months, the human mind fills that gap with rumors, fear, and herd-driven guesses. This actually increases market volatility rather than decreasing it. Investors start looking for proxy signals. They watch the CEO's Twitter account, they track private jet movements, and they jump at every shadow. This lack of transparency triggers our primal survival instincts. We become hypervigilant and prone to panic. It's the same reason people are afraid of the dark. It's not the absence of light that scares us. It's the possibility of what might be hiding in the shadows. Think of it like driving a car on a winding mountain road. Quarterly reporting is like having your headlights on high beam. You can see the curves coming. You can see the obstacles, and you can adjust your speed accordingly. Now, imagine the government tells you that to save energy, you can only flick your lights on once every few miles. You have to drive in total darkness for 10 minutes. Then you get a split second of light to see where you are, and then it's back to darkness. You might be able to stay on the road for a while, but your anxiety is going to be through the roof, and the moment a deer jumps out in front of you, during the dark period, you're finished. That is what semi-annual reporting does to the average investor. It turns a manageable journey into a high-stakes gamble, where you're just hoping nothing changes in the long stretches of silence. But amidst all this uncertainty, there is one area where the smart money is building a fortress, and that is in foundational technology, specifically semiconductors. While the world worries about layoffs and transparency, the people who actually run the global machine are doubling down on companies like Intel and Micron. They understand that no matter how many people get laid off, and no matter how often companies report their earnings, the world still needs silicon. This mirrors the great railroad boom of the mid-19th century. Back then, there were hundreds of different companies trying to build the next big gadget or the next big city. Most of them failed. Investors lost fortunes betting on which town would become the next hub. But the people who made real generational wealth were the ones who invested in the steel for the tracks and the coal for the engines. It didn't matter which railroad company won the race, because they all had to buy steel from the same few producers. Semiconductors are the steel of the 21st century. Whether the future is dominated by AI, autonomous cars, or a new version of the internet, every single one of those dreams requires massive amounts of processing power. The demand for semiconductors is a secular trend, meaning it is a long-term force that exists regardless of the short-term ups and downs of the economy. By focusing on these foundational assets, sophisticated investors are ignoring the noise of the experience economy and betting on the actual physical requirements of the future. Psychologically, this is a move away from growth, bias, and toward infrastructure security. Most retail investors are drawn to the shiny new app or the trendy service because they are easy to understand. We have a cognitive bias toward things we can see and touch in our daily lives, like a Disney movie or an Uber ride. But the professional investor trains themselves to look for the bottleneck. They ask themselves, what is the one thing that everyone else needs to survive? This requires overcoming the availability heuristic, which is our tendency to overestimate the importance of information that is immediately available to us. Just because you see Ubers everywhere doesn't mean Uber is the best investment. The real power lies in the invisible components that make the Uber app possible. Identifying these bottlenecks provides a psychological sense of safety because you aren't betting on a person's preference, you're betting on a mathematical necessity. To put it in fifth-grade terms, imagine you are in a gold rush. Thousands of people are rushing to a river because they heard someone found a gold nugget. Some people will get lucky and find gold, but most will walk away with nothing but sore backs and empty pockets. Now, imagine you are the person who owns the only store in town that sells shovels. You don't care if the miners find gold or not. They all have to buy a shovel from you just to try. If they find gold, they buy a better shovel. If they don't find gold, they still had to pay you for the first one. Semiconductors are the shovels of the modern world. The tech companies are the miners. Some will strike it rich with AI, and some will go bust. But they all have to come to the semiconductor companies to buy the tools they need to dig. So, how do you actually navigate this multi-speed economy without getting crushed? The answer lies in a strategy of aggressive balance and a global shield. You cannot afford to be all in on one side of this bifurcation. If you are only in consumer stocks, you are vulnerable to the moment the party ends. If you are only in tech, you are vulnerable to the structural purge. Historically, this is how the great merchant families like the Medicis survived for centuries. They never put all their gold in one vault or all their ships on one route. They practiced a form of extreme diversification that included different industries, different currencies, and different countries. When a plague hit one city, their business in another city thrived. When a war broke out on land, their sea routes remained open. They understood that the world is a series of interconnected systems that never all fail. at the exact same time. Today, that means looking beyond the borders of the United States. While the U.S. is the heart of the tech realignment, other markets in Europe, Japan, and emerging economies are running at different speeds. By spreading your exposure across different geographies, you are essentially building a portfolio that can breathe. When one lung is struggling, the other can take over. The psychological hurdle here is loss aversion. Most people are so afraid of losing money in the short term that they fail to position themselves for the long term. We feel the pain of a 10% drop much more intensely than the joy of a 10% gain. This leads to panic selling or performance chasing, where we buy what is already expensive and sell what is currently cheap. To survive, you have to adopt a mindset of dispassionate accumulation. This is where dollar-cost averaging comes in. By investing a fixed amount every month, regardless of whether the market is up or down, you are effectively removing your emotions from the equation. You are admitting that you cannot predict the future, but you can participate in the long-term growth of human ingenuity. It's a psychological hack that turns volatility into your friend, because when prices are low, your fixed dollar amount buys more shares. Think of your portfolio like a high-performance engine with 4 different cylinders. Each cylinder represents a different part of the global economy. Sometimes the consumer spending cylinder is firing perfectly, giving you a lot of power. Other times it might misfire, but the semiconductor cylinder or the international markets cylinder is there to pick up the slack. If you only had a 1-cylinder engine, the moment it stopped, you'd be stranded on the side of the road. But with a multi-speed, multi-cylinder approach, you can keep moving forward. Even if one part of the engine needs a major overhaul, you might not be going at top speed all the time, but you will never be stuck. The global economy is not a single entity that moves in one direction. It is a complex, bifurcated system, where resilience in one sector often masks decay in another. The strong consumer demand we see today is a gift, but it is also a distraction. Behind the scenes, the digital world is being rebuilt, transparency is being reduced, and the foundational layers of technology are being fortified. If you focus only on the headlines of today, you will be blindsided by the structural shifts of tomorrow. We couldn't fit all the deep dive details and practical strategies into this video. Check out the WarmInsight newsletter in the pinned comment and description for the full text summary. Visit www.warminsight.com. See you there.